Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Som TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. Right now, everybody is sitting around thinking, well, they're probably not sitting around. They're probably very busy with the holidays, but you're also thinking, what kind of wine am I going to bring? What are we going to drink? And on Som TV, we are releasing the very first of our quote-unquote master classes on the wines of Portugal. This is a fantastic piece, and on today's podcast, I have wine communicator and one of my most favorite guests, Elaine Chukan Brown. Hi, Elaine. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good. It's nice to drink wine in the morning, as they say.
Amen.
In our profession.
You got to bless the day. Get it started.
That's right. You got to bless the day. And we're going to talk about something that you and I deeply love, which is Portugal as a place, Portugal as a destination, but also Portugal as a wine destination. And so on today's pod, I want to get into a little bit of the history of this great place. We'll talk about the food. We'll try not to gush too much about how this is the best open, it's not a secret, but the best open place you need to go visit. And then we'll do a little wine 101. And then coming up, we're going to have a part 2 of this podcast that's going to go a little deeper into the regions and the grapes for my more wine geeky friends. So for part 1 of this podcast, Elaine, let's start with Portugal as a wine region and kind of like, what is the perception of Portugal wine? You know, I mean, you've been in the wine industry as long as I have, or probably longer, and you've traveled the world. I know you've spent a lot of time in Portugal, and so have I. Where do we start with this place, this country?
Well, I think among wine lovers, there's excitement for Portugal because the wines are so consistently good quality. But I have to admit, with consumers, at least in the U.S., I think knowledge of Portuguese wines is still kind of early and just kind of getting going. But I have to say, we're towards the end of the year, and so we have just a slew of holidays coming up. And a lot of those holidays are celebrated by getting a bunch of people together around a table, have a meal. And most of the holidays, the kind of meal people are having are like lots of different sorts of dishes. So a lot of people have been asking me, well, what should I do? How should I pick wines? And honestly, when you have to give one quick tip, it's smart to come up with, a wine place to go to, a wine region to go to. And being totally upfront honest, I think go to Portuguese wines. The versatility Portuguese wines have at the table is incredible. And the range of wine types and styles that you can find from Portugal is really impressive, but they all work for food. Like, that's the thing about Portuguese wines that's so brilliant. They're delicious and they work for food, So as we're coming into the end of the year, this is a perfect time to be talking about Portuguese wines.
I couldn't agree more. I think, well, for one, I think it's one thing to try wines from Portugal, and I think it's one thing to be in a restaurant and have them. You and I have the advantage of having spent some time on the ground, me filming and going all the way north to south. And I think you as a journalist, right? You were there when you were working and writing.
Yeah, and I followed people through Harvest a couple times and stuff like that. Yeah.
I can't, off the top of my head, name a more dynamic place. It is, I'm going to regret saying this, but I think the first thing that comes to mind with people is port. And I happen to love port, but I can't imagine that the amount of wine made in this country, it has to dwarf port production by such a huge margin. And whites, reds. In fact, people who listen to this know that I really do like rosé. I like finely, very well-crafted rosé, and Portugal has some of the most stunning examples of that. Like I said, we're going to gush about this because it's kind of been a long time coming. We haven't done anything on this region on Som TV nor the podcast, and so it's sort of been building up. Why don't we talk a little bit about your experience in Portugal? So what was it like when you went there? Any preconceived ideas, and then what was it like when you were on the ground there?
I honestly,
from a wine and food perspective.
Yeah, so my first trip to Portugal, I was able to spend 2 or 2.5 weeks, and we went all the way, south to Alentejo and spent several days there all over that region, and then drove north through the country and went through the Dow and then the Douro and then up into Vinho Verde. I even got to do like river trips in, like afternoon river trips in a couple parts of the country. And I just immediately felt good. traveling is a lot of fun, of course, and it's easy to fall in love with another country because you're only going to be there for a little bit of time anyway. But there's just this resonance that I feel with Portugal that is really moving. And, the history there is incredible. Like this region, you can travel around the country and see historical sites all the way back to the pre-Roman era, actually. And the thing that I find fascinating is that there's these kind of layers of influence, so that when you're connecting to Portuguese food and going into different parts of the country, you really feel this strength of local tradition. And it has this kind of gravity effect for me that I admire so much. And the truth is that when I had to leave Portugal after that first trip, I was heartbroken. I can't in any way explain it because I had never been there before. This is years ago now. I had never been there before, but I was heartbroken to leave. And I felt heartsick and homesick for more than 3 months. I felt like I had left home for the first time and I didn't know when I'd get to go back. And it was like, it was painful. I missed it so much. I just really fell in love with it.
I have to say there's a warmth from the people there. Obviously a lot of my experience has been with wineries, north and south. And across the board, I found Portugal to be one of the most welcoming. There is in a deep proudness of their tradition. And I would say, wine aside, as a food destination, Portugal is probably one of my favorite places on earth.
Oh my gosh, I loved everything I ate there.
The seafood, in most of the country, is so different in the south than the north, and yet at an absolute pinnacle of how good it is. And so I think if you're a food person and you are looking for a place to go, I always wonder, like, it's like kind of like what came first, chicken or egg. You look at Portugal and you look at the wines and then you look at the food, and there is this incredible element of what came first, which one complemented the other first. And, what they do with, like, salted fish and fresh seafood. And, you look at the beef and the lamb and all of the different meat, the way they prepare meat over fire. It is just, you sort of get an idea of where so many other countries got that tradition and how it kind of came about.
They have incredible carpaccio too, like the meat preparations are so varied as well. And also varied by parts of the country that you're in.
I think for me, when I was there, I was on the border of Spain and Portugal in the north, sort of in the Vinho Verde region. And I will never forget, because you'd think you're just stepping across a river, essentially, and on one side is Portugal and on the other side, and I'm talking it's not a raging river, so it's small enough that you could walk across if you needed to. And yet the difference in wine styles from Spain to Portugal is incredible. I mean, it's they're doing Alvarinho up there. And when you cross over into Portugal, there's such a different, very unique style. And strangely, or maybe not strangely, it complements the food up there in a way that I just think that's the mark of a place that's been doing it for so long. This is not, we engineered a cab or something like that to sort of be like a French style. Their wines speak completely on their own. And so when we get into a kind of like conversation about wine 101 about Portugal, where do we start, Elaine? How do you start talking about, this is what you do for a profession. How do you start talking about Portuguese wine to somebody who maybe they know it a little, maybe they're thinking about that in some other wine, and you kind of want to steer them towards?
Well, I think what you've been getting at is actually a great place to start. There's the classroom environment. That's one thing, and that's more formalized often. But like, if we're just talking about everyday conversations, you and I got to enjoy the Azevedo together from Vinho Verde, and it's such a perfect food wine. And so I think that's the entree, right? Like, what do you love to eat? What other wines do you enjoy? Like, what do you find delicious? Like, that's such a perfect entry point. And the thing about the Azevedo that I admire so much is that there's this like brilliant, racy, crystalline acidity that just keeps your mouth watering. So you're kind of being refreshed and desirous at the same time, like you just want more. But then there's also this breadth of flavor that opens up in the mouth as you continue to drink the wine. So that's where that satisfaction comes in. You can really enjoy that flavor even at the same time that the wine is refreshing you. And for me, I think that combination is what I consistently find in Portuguese wines, where there's this satisfaction of flavor and nuance of flavor that is coupled with this refreshing quality, even in reds as well. And I think that combination is really unique to the place, that fullness of flavor and respect for structural integrity and length and mouth-watering presence all at the same time. That's what I find in Portuguese wines. So then which flavor family do you want to go towards? That becomes the next question. Do you want a heartier red, or do you want a brighter, fruitier red, or do you want that stick with white, or do you want to go into port like you were mentioning before?
Yeah, I want to go back to the Alvarinho. So I'm holding this bottle and listening to you talk about it. I'm like, I'm 2 seconds away from cracking it open. Do you think that there's an obstacle, or at least a hesitation, or maybe just a learning curve, just with the fact that the grapes have names that maybe people haven't heard of? Like we're talking about the Azevedo, which is a white wine from Vinho Verde, and the grapes in it are Alvarinho, which is the same grape as Albarino in Spain, and then Loureiro. I don't know if I'm saying that. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm sure my Portuguese friends are laughing at me at the moment. But these are not, you don't show up to a bar and say, hey, can I have a glass of Loureiro? It's not a common thing, at least in the States. And so how do you get people to go, I want to try a wine that's something I've never heard of? I mean, for people like you and I, that's what we seek out. We want to try the new stuff, or try something that's a little, maybe not the first thing on the wine list. Do you think that's an obstacle?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think that people are more curious than we give them credit for in wine. Like a lot of times in wine, we assume the consumer is a certain set of person and act like we know what they want. But my experience traveling around is that people are pretty curious and interested. And when we're open, and to be really frank, when we're open and non-judgmental, people are pretty willing to try things, and I think that it's something that we in the wine world need to practice more and more, is being like flexible and open and non-judgmental and willing to share. And when we come at it that way, it's fun for someone to try to say a word they've never seen before, But
Right.
But at the same time, I've met a lot of consumers that admit they don't even know how to say Pinot Noir. Like, this, is it Pinot Noir? Like, what is this word, right? And so, and I think, that's one of the more common grapes in the world. And if they feel like the person serving them expects them to do it exactly right, they're going to be less interested in trying something new. It's riskier then, right? So I've seen people be really curious, and when I've presented Portuguese wines to people and talked about grapes they've never heard, they've gotten excited about it. But my hope is that I'm pretty easygoing about making mistakes in pronunciation and things like that. And I think it makes it easier for people to try stuff. So that's the big thing. Like, as wine professionals, it's our job to be kind of open and flexible and willing to share with a more easygoing attitude, rather than acting like wine is supposed to be done one specific correct way.
For the listeners, I just want to tell you, Elaine is very open and non-judgmental, unless you're talking about 80s and 90s music or some films. Then you better be right, because she's going to jump on you for that.
Movie critiques and and music. That's the one thing where you might get a talking to. It's true. But that's food, right. Wine, creative writing, animals, all this stuff, that's all easygoing.
Yeah, that's fair. Getting back to the wine, I think that there's a very fascinating. I want to mention it. No wine region wants to be called a bargain. No wine region wants to be called a deal. But I can tell you that these wines we're talking about right now in Portugal, they bat so far above their average. I mean, they are not like, certain regions are defined by being expensive, or by being pricey, or by being rare. I think Portuguese wine is defined by quality. Truly, top to bottom, it's defined by being good. And it's a really fascinating thing that when you talk about price, there's this automatic thing of like, look, it price comes into it. And for me, price is always the opposite. Price, when I look at a wine quality, I always want to know what did it cost. Because for me, there's always this kind of scale where something can be incredibly good, but if it's hard to get and it's very expensive, it takes a couple notches off the belt for me for that particular product in the way that it's not for me anymore. And the thing about these wines that we're talking about, and we'll get into some reds here, which are like, showstoppers, especially for what we're talking about the holidays. These wines are for me. They
Yeah.
really are. Like,
Yeah.
I can actually drink these wines, and I could have a full dinner with these wines and be able to let people explore them, pair them perfectly with the food we're going to serve, and then not have to be like, and I killed myself financially to do it. It's really an amazing situation in this country. And I always get nervous when I talk like this because I'm afraid it'll get more expensive.
Well, I mean, I have to say, like, I don't think luxury, being seen as luxury status, is necessarily an admirable path. Like, that's not necessarily the best thing to pursue for wine, because the truth is that for a wine region to last, to sustain itself, it has to also be accessible. And so being able to make consistently for an entire country to so consistently deliver the kind of quality that Portugal does at prices that are more affordable, like, I actually think that's hugely admirable. I could drink Portuguese wines every day, like, happily, but also because I could afford to. And I actually think that's a huge advantage. That means that Portuguese wines can remain available and accessible to people. And that means that that country, that as a wine region, can sustain itself over time. Like, that's a positive in my mind.
Definitely. So there's another producer we want to talk about in the reds from the Douro. And just really quick, can you do like 1 minute on the Douro? What this, it's one of the most stunning, beautiful places I've ever stood foot. And can you just talk a little bit about the region? I know we're going to go deeper in the next podcast, but
Yeah, so the Douro Valley it's just incredible to step into. It's overwhelming. It's so beautiful. And so it's this rugged, very steep sloped river valley carved by the Douro River. But there's just turn after turn, layer after layer of ridgeline and mountain slope that it just goes back so incredibly far. And there's in parts of the valley, there's like one road hugged alongside a completely steep slope. And then the other side of the road is this drop straight into the Douro River. So you got to really be no wine tasting and driving in this place. Like, get someone to drive for you because the roads are serious, And because of how steep the slopes are, most vineyards are terraced. And so that's part of what's so incredible too. Like, the texture of this landscape is incredible because you come around the bend into the Douro Valley, and everywhere you look, there are these incredible mountain formations that have been cut by hand, by people, into these terraced steps that are planted to vine. And they're farmed, everything's farmed by hand for the most part. Because again, it's these steep slopes, terraces. You don't get a lot of machinery onto landscapes like that, right? So the idea that this place has persisted for centuries and consistently made one of the most famous wines in the world, port, is incredible. But now we're in this age where the Douro also makes really beautiful dry table wine, not just, port wine, but also really a beautiful range of dry table wines. And you and I were able to share some of those together too.
yeah, I should say, this episode that's on Time TV right now with Elaine, who, the first episode is about the regions of Portugal, and it is tremendous. What she's describing, you don't get to see. It is breathtakingly filmed. And, it's the kind of place where you go. We have another pod coming in the future that's about the most extreme vineyards in the world. And I can tell you, spoiler alert, this place is going to be on it. There are some places that I have walked where I don't know how they harvest without ropes. I mean, like, tied to their waists. It is so insane. And when people are willing to do that kind of effort for something, You know, whatever that something is going to be tremendous. And so the reds that we open up or some of the reds that we open up in your masterclass, one of them is Casa Ferrarina. And they make several different wines of very, very, very high quality. So these are wines that I say easily stand up to any of the other great reds of Europe. I mean, they really are at that, at that kind of a quality level, and especially when you throw food into the equation. And man, would I love to have these with some age. These particular wines are, again, they're the kind of thing where in a lot of cases you may not know the grapes. You may not have heard of the grapes. And I think, is Portugal, from a blending standpoint, places that blend grapes together traditionally, is that more or less misunderstood, from a standpoint of style?
I think we're in this turning point culturally, in terms of wine consumption, where if you just look at the top selling wines of the last several years, actually most of them are blends. So I think that those of us that have been neck deep in the wine industry for years are used to thinking people want very clear categories, like a specific grape type that they recognize, Cabernet Sauvignon or Pinot Noir, But actually, if you're talking about the general consumer, they want wine that's delicious. And the advantage of a blend is you can find that perfect balance of, again, flavor, structural integrity, mouthwatering quality, and that makes you go, oh my God, yes, this is so good. And I think that, again, if you look at wine sales the last several years, blends and especially red blends are dominating. And so as wine professionals, we should get on board with that. And Portugal, again, has been leading that charge for centuries, both in terms of how they plant vineyards with the field blend style, so that the blend is in the vineyard itself. And then also more recently in making blends from the cellar as well. Portugal just, when it comes to really beautifully balanced, delicious blends, Portugal just kills it. They're so good at it. They have lots of experience, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah. What are some of the grapes that are in these two different bottles that I'm looking at here?
Yeah.
Quinta de Lada.
Yeah. So Touriga Franca, Touriga Nacional, those are two of the kind of iconic grapes of the Douro. And again, they do really beautifully in both sweet wines and table wines. And in my mind, there's this kind of depth of flavor that they offer, but with this very lithe, lighter sort of frame. And so getting that kind of layers of flavor, that complexity with a sense of lightness on the palate, that's such a beautiful quality to find in a wine. And it's something that I really admire about this particular producer and the work that they do.
Yeah, it's great stuff. I mean, I think the point of this pod was just to give people a little taste of at least our enthusiasm for Portugal. It's tough not to just gush. I know we did a lot of it on this pod. In part 2, we're actually going to talk about the grapes in Portugal. We're going to talk about the regions. And don't worry, there won't be a test on this, everyone. You can go to Som TV and watch the first masterclass. We also have a second coming with Elaine, and then a full documentary about the wines of Portugal, which is going to be tremendous. So we are firmly in the camp of wanting you to explore this region. And I could do probably 2 hours on the food there. But needless to say, the wines that they make go with the food here very well as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Elaine, I want to thank you for being on this. Stay tuned for our part 2 of Portugal, where we're going to get pretty geeky. And make sure you go to somtv.com and watch Elaine's episode. It is very good. Elaine, you are very good at your job.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. Thanks so much.
Of course. Everybody go to somtv.com. SomTV is only $49.99 for an entire year. You're looking for a gift? This one's instant. And you will be loved for an entire year for purchasing it. All right, everybody, be safe. Drink some Portuguese wine. And if you have extra, send it to me.